For today, we have one of our favorite presenters, Marjorie Levine-Clark. She's been at the Arts and Medicine Monday lecture series a number of times. And she's going to be talking about unemployment in my practice, physicians' perspectives on unemployment and health in 1980s Britain, which is a very interesting time. Let me give you a little bit of background about Marjorie. She's professor of history and associate dean of diversity, outreach, and initiative in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences on the Denver campus. She has published widely on gender, health, welfare, and poverty, including 2 books, Unemployment, Welfare, and Masculine Citizenship, So Much Poverty in Britain, 1870 to 1930, and that came out in 2015, and actually you did a talk on that for us. And Beyond the Reproductive Body, the Politics of Women's Health and Work in Early Victorian England, and that was published by Ohio State University Press in 2004. She is co-director with me of the Health Humanities minor, and she teaches a variety of courses related to the history of medicine. This presentation today comes from a new book project, tentatively titled Unemployment, Health, and the Body from the New Poor Law to Thatcher. Welcome, Marjorie. Thank you for coming back.
Thank you. It is always a pleasure to be here. And today is especially fun because this is the first time I'm debuting this material. So you are my first audience for this work. And so any feedback you have, I will really welcome. And I want to say at the outset, there are 2 photographs in this, well, other than photographs of Margaret Thatcher. There are 2 photographs of unemployed youth. And they're by a photographer I discovered just by kind of looking for images on the web. Her name is Tish Murtha. And she did studies of what's called, one of her collections is called Youth Unemployment. And in the northeast of England around Newcastle. And all these photos are from 1981, which is the year that I'm going to be looking at. And her work is absolutely fantastic. And I urge you to kind of look into her. She's easy to find on the web, and her daughter is kind of promoting her work, trying to get her to get more attention. She has a couple of series, but she died at 57 of an aneurysm. But she was really interested in photographing marginalized communities in her area what was the 1980s. And that area was really in bad shape. I actually talk a little bit about it today. So thank you again, Tess, for the invitation. Or perhaps I invited myself. That could have happened too. This is always fun. And for those of you behind me, I've been told I have to stand here because this is being videotaped. So I'm sorry, I probably won't be turning around to look at you. But all right, so the talk I think should run about half an hour to 35 minutes. It's a little short. So we'll have lots of time for discussion, although probably in the context here, it'll run longer than I think it will. In 1981, the British Medical Journal ran a series of 9 short essays from May to September, and each one was called Unemployment in My Practice. So each of these essays were framed like this. They're written by general practitioners from a variety of locations across the United Kingdom. And from the content of the essays, it's clear that the journal editor had asked the GPs to reflect on how increasing unemployment had been affecting their patients and what it meant overall for their practices. And I'm guessing that it was the deputy editor, Dr. Tony Smith, who was motivated to put the series together. His obituary describes him as a committed socialist who came from a working class family that had experienced hard times. So asking doctors to reflect on the impact of unemployment on their practices would seem to be right up his alley. I also read somewhere that he was not a fan of Thatcher. So this also would fit right into there. 1981 was an ideal for these reflections. There we go. Margaret Thatcher had been prime minister for 2 years, and her policies had had time to have an impact on the nation. By 1981, unemployment had reached 12% nationally, with significant regional variations. Thatcherism as an ideology accepted mass unemployment as a price worth paying to push through privatization, free market policies, assaults on trade unions, and cuts to the welfare state. The government ignored the growing health inequalities resulting from Thatcherite policy implementation. And this just shows you the spending on the National Health Service differences. You can see in 1981, 82, goes up a little in 83, but then 85, 86, that area, which is when I'm going to be talking about 81, 82. It's really, really low. So health spending goes down tremendously. One result of Thatcher's willingness to see both unemployment and health inequities rise, according to the journal Essays, was that by 1981, general practitioners had become sounding boards for the growing numbers of unemployed people and their families. Their surgeries were a place to go to fill up empty time. Doctors found themselves not only treating the physical and mental illnesses that resulted from unemployment, but also serving as community counselors. My main interest in this talk today is to explore what we can learn about relationships between unemployment and health from the general practitioner's reflections. This exploration is part of a larger book project I'm working on that Tess talked about, tentatively titled Unemployment, Health, and the Body in Britain, from the New Poor Law to Thatcher. And the New Poor Law was introduced in 1834, so this is a big swath of time. I'm also interested, however, in exploring what the general practitioners themselves learned from their encounters with their patients about unemployment, about the meaning of work and health, about what it meant to live a working class life. Scholars have established the mutually supporting relationship between the implementation of Thatcherite policies and an increase of health problems among the poor. And those who fell into the category poor increased significantly in the early 80s. The number of people applying for unemployment benefits grew from about 1 million in 1981 to about 3 million in 1983. Middle-aged people who had worked all their lives were made redundant. Young people graduated from school with no employment prospects. Class inequalities that had been exacerbated by Thatcher's public policies were the subject of heated debate and government denial with regard to their health equity implications. Studies from the 1930s, the last period of severe unemployment, had found that extreme hardship with accompanying physical and mental deterioration was the norm for the unemployed, and that emotional instability, general loss of morale, distorted time sense, and social isolation were common. The decade of the 30s was actually the first time when medical professionals and social scientists undertook systematic studies of the relationships between unemployment and health. During the 1980s, studies concerning the relationships between unemployment and mental health concluded that unemployed people experience higher levels of depression, anxiety, and general distress, together with lower self-esteem and confidence. Stringent attitudes towards welfare did not help unemployed people shake the feeling of stigma created by Thatcher's very public pronouncements that if they would only try harder, they would be employed. My policies, she famously argued, are based not on some economics theory, but on things I and millions like me were brought up with. An honest day's work for an honest day's pay, live within your means, put by a nest egg for rainy days, pay your bills on time, support the police. Several of the doctors who wrote the journal Essays reflected the attitude that poor men were untrustworthy, and perhaps Thatcher's tough love was a good thing. They wrote that before the unemployment crisis, Their normal interactions with working class men were functional. Working men would use them primarily to try to get out of their jobs. Men in their towns most often came to see them with requests for medical certificates, attesting that they were unable to work due to health reasons. The language doctors used to describe these interactions spoke of their patients somewhat unsympathetically. Dr. K.B. Thomas, for example, a general practitioner from Waterlooville, a suburb of Portsmouth in the south of England, told the story of a gentleman who is much better known to me than I would have wished. He used to burst into my room without knocking with the words, "It's gone again, Doc." I always asked, "What's gone?" although I knew perfectly well, and he would reply, "My back." Then after a negative examination, I would mention the subject of work. He would purse his lips and inhale a volume of air audibly while half closing his eyes. His expression was a mixture of incredulity, sadness at the thought that I should expect him to work, and pain at the idea of actually performing it. A moment later, he had taken my proffered certificate and departed with an agility through the door. He was never interested in treatment. In this narrative, working class men are tricksters in the medical encounter who do not want to work and who manipulate doctors to avoid performing their jobs. They would rather be on disability pay. Here, the practitioner aligned with Thatcherite views that emphasized a bloated welfare state fed by unjustified benefits. Yet this GP went on to describe a more recent encounter with this same man, who came to him with a cold for which the doctor gave him a prescription. Then there was a pause as I waited for him to ask for a certificate. Now, however, the man was unemployed, which Dr. Thomas knew simply from the faint, wistful smile that was almost apologetic, regretful that he could not fulfill his traditional role. Thomas recognized that the rules of the game had been changed, and he felt a little sad. Unemployment altered the relationship between this doctor and his patient, disrupting their usual patterns and transforming the practitioner's attitude from condescension to sympathy. Whereas it was the patient who felt sad in the first exchange because the physician expected him to work. In the second instance, Dr. Thomas himself expressed sadness at the changed circumstances. The patient no longer had the power to manipulate the system. The certificate was useless, and he was failing his family as an unemployed man, unable to fulfill his traditional role. In another essay, the general practitioner C.P. Tanner of South Shields near Newcastle, and this is actually the area that Tish Murtha photographed in the north of England. He described how things had changed for his patients now that more than 1 in 5 were out of work. Indeed, the area was one of the hardest hit by Thatcher's policies. A patient, Eddie, a minor, had usually asked for a medical certificate, but now was clearly too afraid to lose his job if he missed a day by claiming illness. Dr. Tanner described the situation. Eddie is 40. He works in the pit and has severe obstructive airways disease. In the past, he has had a lot of time off work and has been noticeably reluctant to go back. Today, his chest is worse again. His treatment is adjusted, and I reach for the certificate. "Not this time, doctor. Do you think you can manage?" He stands up and seems a foot taller. "I'll manage." Unlike Dr. Thomas, Dr. Tanner was clearly aware of the tensions brought on by his patient's health problems. He struggled with whether or not Eddie should be going down into a mine while having difficulty breathing. Eddie, however, obviously needed to stay at his job, even though he was suffering, in order to avoid unemployment. Dr. Tanner explained that local industries were using their employees' health problems as an excuse to lay men off. If the condition comes to light at whatever stage of his career, he is discharged. As one discharged chief shipping engineer said, I wish I'd never listened to all that crap you fed me about my blood pressure. I might have not lived as long, but at least it would have been better for me and my family. Having a job and living with poor health to this man were compatible. Unemployment was the true danger. In these encounters, it was the doctors urging the men to take time off to heal. As workers, however, the men regarded time off as the first step to the loss of a job. The GP, Roger Higgs of Walworth in Southeast London, commented, "Time and rest are effective remedies and hitherto cheap, but they are becoming more difficult to prescribe." Men who before would have been pleased to ask for an incapacity certificate and to rest at home now went to work with serious conditions and in pain in order to provide for their families and maintain their sense of masculine identity as workers. Dr. John Mackay of Glasgow expressed his own sense of powerlessness in the face of the circumstances. "I feel frustrated because I find it difficult to restore a man's self-respect when he is obviously devalued in his own eyes and in the view of his family." According to these essays, then, doctors were well aware of the very messy connections between health status and unemployment. A man in poor health was more likely to join the ranks of the unemployed, and so workers tried not to give in to their ailments. As Mervyn Goodman, a GP from Liverpool, put it, "The requests for national insurance statements of incapacity have dropped considerably. Many patients fear that absence through illness may jeopardize their jobs, especially when there is any possibility of manpower reduction, while those who are unemployed now have no need for such statements." Additionally, fear of job loss prevented employed men from going to the doctor in the first place. According to the GP Albert Jacob of Dundee in Scotland, those with an uncertain job future are prevented from seeking attention for fear of work absence. And this is where Dundee is, up in Scotland. Simply by asking for time off to see a doctor, a man put a job at risk. Why would an employer keep on a worker with potential health problems when he had his pick of men for the position? According to Dr. Tanner of South Shields, industries were undertaking very strict surveillance of men they assumed had health issues, waiting for something to emerge to shake out men who were not completely healthy. Doctors worried about their middle-aged male patients whose unemployment caused them to react to their bodies and health dilemmas in new ways. Dr. John Wilson from a rural area outside Belfast described healthy middle-aged men who arrive with complaints with minimal pathology but insist on full checkups because they now have more time, with the result that the fears of serious illness are greater. Dr. Jacob of Dundee wrote of Mr. M, whose chronic back pain had forced him to quit his job as a bus driver. Finding another job was a non-starter for a man in his 50s, mid-50s, with no skills other than his ability to drive a bus. In any case, no employer is likely to look favorably on a recruit with a physical difficulty if he can get a fit man to do the job. And with unemployment, there are plenty of fit men looking for work. Dr. Jacobs signed off on a certificate that Mr. M should not work. Interestingly, the regional medical officer initially contested Jacobs' finding before finally accepting it. And I want to look more into that. I'm not really sure what was going on. Telling Jacob that employment was not within GP's remit, where essentially this whole story is about how employment was within GP's remit. So I need to follow up on that. Writing about his own sense of powerlessness, Jacob explained, "I have not seen the last of Mr. M. He still has his backache. He will not get a job, and his morale is dropping. He will need a great deal of support, and yet 10 years ago, he would have been in one of our factories within weeks of the original accident, happily contributing to the welfare of the community." If employment had been available, Mr. M would have had a chance in a different field other than as a bus driver. Now, however, Dr. Jacob believed Mr. M's unemployment was permanent. In addition to physical ability, doctors pointed to age as a category that damaged men's chances for work. Once a man reached a certain age, he essentially became unemployable because there were so many younger men available. For example, Dr. Jacob concluded that there's a nagging feeling that too many middle-aged men are being thrown on the industrial junk heap. And this word of junk heap, scrap heap, men being on the junk heap or scrap heap kind of recurs in these essays. Dr. Mervyn Goodman of Liverpool mentioned that older middle-aged men who have minor handicaps or a minimal degree of ill health had to take early retirement because of the lack of jobs. He remarked that it was useless to send these men to look for new types of positions, both because of their age and because the positions simply didn't exist. I mean, in earlier times, you could just kind of go for retraining, for other positions, but now it was useless to do that. Age affected those on the other side of the life cycle as well. Younger men made up another type of patient the GPs wrote about, the school leaver, who had no job to turn to once he left school. And these are people essentially coming out of high school. The problem of school leavers was particularly acute in Thatcher's Britain. These were the generally 16-year-olds who could not find their first job and immediately went on benefits. A study of unemployed school leavers found that they suffered from many of the same issues as unemployed adults: depression, boredom, and low self-esteem. Additionally, however, the study also remarked on the central place of work in developing an adult identity. If a teenager did not make a smooth transition from boy to man through finding work, he could develop other mental and physical health problems. And all of this is very gendered. The concern was with adolescents becoming men, and I'll have more to say about this, as will the doctors. The lack of work was the case with Billy, a patient of Dr. Jacob, one of the many school leavers who has failed to find a job. Billy was having problems with drugs and alcohol, and Jacob seemed very attuned to the issues unemployment posed for the identity and adulthood of young men in his community. According to this GP, of course, unemployment does not cause drug abuse or alcoholism, but prolonged idleness gives these youngsters an opportunity they would not otherwise have for this type of activity. The problem is that a job gives one self-respect. To work means to contribute and play one's part as a full adult. It should be the first step a youngster takes toward the development of his adult psyche. Without this, he, and it is usually he in my practice, will look for other avenues in which to assert his adulthood. Adulthood also meant, and of course this is constructed, right? I mean, the idea that work makes you an adult, work makes you a man, right? This is part of what I'm gonna look at in the project, but for today, we're just taking that as a given, okay? Because that's how the doctors are talking about it. Adulthood also meant taking on particular gender roles, again, constructed. For working class men, that meant above all work and providing for families. Yet unemployment stripped away the possibility of fulfilling these roles. The GP Jacob continued his commentary on Billy, reflecting, in my part of the world, alcohol intake is equated with manliness, and these youngsters compensate for the other deficiencies in their developing lifestyle by demonstrating their prowess with the bottle. Rather than modeling masculinity through work and home life, these young men were left with alcohol and street culture. Dr. Jacob astutely remarked, male chauvinism is not all advantage to the male, which I thought was really interesting. Dr. Wilson also expressed, my fear is for the youth of the practice. They are now showing signs of vandalism, drunkenness, rowdiness, and general loss of morale. They need help, even if it is only having someone agree that they have a problem, because their problems will only end when employment comes back to our practice. Dr. Tanner of South Shields described another model of school leaver, one who gave in to social isolation, also a noted effect of unemployment. He wrote about the young man of 18 with a rising attendance rate to surgery who presents with increasing introspection and concern with his soma and turns out to have never had a job. He is bored and uninterested with little to look forward to and fewer ideas about how to occupy himself. Here we have the detached teenager turned inward, focusing on his body, perhaps as a way to avoid the outside world. He attends the doctor because he has nothing else to do, maybe imagining phantom illnesses to explain to himself why he cannot get a job. Chances are he also set up the appointment because he simply wanted someplace to go and someone to talk to. Problems with alcohol were not limited to school leavers. Indeed, almost all the GPs discussed how unemployment increased alcohol consumption among men. Dr. Roger Higgs of Walworth in Southeast London wrote of Jimmy, an Irishman who he described as quite bright, well-built, and usually healthy. Unemployment, however, had led to heavy drinking, and he found companionship at the pub instead of at work. This is also repeated in several of the essays. He lost his accommodations and, according to Higgs, his self-esteem. Higgs wrote, now dry and in control, we could both see how he had to climb back again, and the first step was a job. But this treatment was no longer on the market, right? So if you're going to get well, right, the job was the treatment, but it wasn't available. Higgs was tempted to prescribe tranquilizers, but decided against this alternative, potentially addictive substance. He ended the essay frustrated by a lack of answers. These GPs saw men whose bodies let them down in the face of layoffs. They saw young men whose psychological profiles were damaged by the failure to find meaning in their lives without the opportunity to take up a job. They also saw women. Yet few of the doctors who wrote these essays discuss women primarily as workers who had to deal with the problem of their own unemployment. Rather, they wrote about women as wives who lived with unemployed husbands. They focused particularly on wives' problems with anxiety and stress. A 1988 study of Boston, which also represented men as workers and women as wives, found that while husbands' depression and anxiety came on pretty immediately with unemployment, their wives' symptoms were delayed and tended to be expressed after their husbands were unemployed for several months. When they did react to their husband's unemployment, however, wives experienced somatic complaints, interpersonal sensitivity, hostility, depression, and anxiety. And interestingly, according to the Boston study, these experiences were unique to blue-collar women. The GPs writing in the British Medical Journal explained that wives' anxiety increased because their husbands were around the house too much. For working-class women, the home was supposed to be women's place, women's space. Men belonged at work and in the pub. This isn't to say that women didn't also work, but things got distorted if a man hung around the house. For example, Dr. John Mackay of Glasgow wrote, "To the overburdened wife, the husband about the house is like having another child, almost a handicapped child, constantly around her. Stress eventually develops and health visitors report increased abuse of the wives." This passage is obviously very interesting. It was not enough for this doctor to liken the unemployed man to a child, suggesting another dependent for his wife to deal with, but using the language of the day, almost a handicapped child, he tries to really highlight the point about the husband's helplessness around the home, which requires the wife mother to be entirely on call. Considering the audience for this essay would be other medical professionals, Mackay's allusion to a disabled child suggests a shared understanding among the medical community that disability caused enormous burdens for poor families. The other element Dr. Mackay emphasized was an increase in domestic abuse. John Wilson, the GP who worked in a rural area outside Belfast, also commented, Wives are consulting more frequently with mild depression owing to financial problems, and the fact that the husband is around the house for too long each day causes marital disharmony, even to the stage of wife battering, almost unknown in the practice 3 years ago. The reality was that these unemployed men were not children, but rather adults whose inability to play the male breadwinner role led to violence in their households. Wives not only suffered from mild depression, but from physical abuse. Their doctors recognized it, but it's unclear from the essays what they did about it. As Dr. Wilson mentioned, wives also became depressed because of the financial strains of having husbands out of work. According to the GP Mervyn Goodman, wives sought out the doctor with symptoms of anxiety, depression resulting from economic factors. He thought that it is surprising in how many households it is the wife who is left to cope with the family financial problems. In these instances, the doctor has become the agency par excellence, who is expected to cure the problem or alleviate the symptoms. And it is difficult to explain that a prescription for benzodiazepines will not make the unpaid electricity or gas bill miraculously disappear. Working class women had long been responsible for household budgets, a fact about which Goodman was clearly ignorant. And his remarks regarding women's inability to understand the difference between the impact of benzos and the continuing existence of unpaid bills suggests a good deal of gender and class condescension. Unemployment itself, some of these doctors suggest, made men sick. Dr. Wilson wrote that a young man presented with chest pain on the afternoon he got his redundancy letter. 1 month later, he was successful in getting an interview for a new occupation, and his pain cleared and has not recurred. Dr. M. Hamid Hussein of Rotherham in South Yorkshire, a deindustrializing steel region, argued that, in my experience, the fear of unemployment and the feeling of insecurity that this can bring is more responsible for mental stress and psychological trauma than unemployment itself. It is almost as if the pressure is released once the catastrophe has happened. He also used the example of a young man who came to see him with chest pain. In this case, while his firm's redundancy plans were being drawn. However, he is conspicuous, oh sorry, I think I didn't there. Yes, he has been conspicuously absent from the surgery once he actually lost his job. In these cases, work or unemployment cured the ills of thinking about unemployment. Unemployment equated to the, employment, work, equated to the normal, healthy state of being, while being unemployed or the thought of being unemployed brought on very real symptoms of illness. The GPs who wrote about the topic at all concluded that out-of-work women and immigrants held up to unemployment better than native British men. Unemployed women, they assumed, had other tasks to keep them occupied in the household and so could keep themselves busy, not dwelling so much on being out of work. I'd like to add that, unlike Ben, in the 1980s, employment was still not a fundamental aspect of working class women's identities. So the lack of a job would not have the same psychological impact for women as it would have for working class men, who were supposed to be the family breadwinners and expected to have work as a key aspect of becoming a man. Now, single women out of work would have different kinds of anxieties, obviously, than working wives. Only Dr. Hussein wrote about his perceptions of the impact of unemployment on the health of immigrants in his community. He found that the Asians that he came into contact with, in spite of being disproportionately affected by unemployment, were able to stand up to the stress of unemployment with fewer problems than the native British population. He attributed this to their ability to deal more readily with poverty because of their strong family ties and little attachment to material goods. And Asian in Britain includes Indian and Pakistan. The reference is more towards those communities than, say, in the US to Chinese and Japanese. Their experiences with unemployed patients made these general practitioners think about work in new ways. Dr. Wilson commented that it is sometimes soul destroying when you know that you are writing references for 6 men, all of whom are after the same job. He could attest to the health of these men, but he could not promise that their positive health status would secure them a job. Dr. Roger Higgs of Walworth in London wrote of his new understanding. I had thought when I had seen the plasterer that he simply needed work to get money. But as the weeks have passed, I've seen that it is his own value, not that of the pay packet, that is in question. This doctor came to realize that for working class men, having work did not just mean being financially stable. It was also a core part of their identities and therefore of their psychological stability. He added that for the others, losing work had threatened family survival and the only safe source of companionship and therapy. Dr. K.B. Thomas of Waterlooville commented, work is such an important part of our lives that if there is to be no work for some people, and I read that full employment may never come back, then work must be created, perhaps second-class work at a lower rate of pay. To have a large section of the community doing nothing for a long time is a certain recipe for disaster. Disaster for the individual, and perhaps disaster for society. Dr. Thomas certainly understood the importance of keeping people employed for their well-being, but his solution harkened back to the poor law and public works that stigmatized unemployed people. The doctors who contributed to the Unemployment in My Practice series in the British Medical Journal wrote openly about their patients' struggles with unemployment and their own challenges in becoming aware of the changing dynamics in their communities. Many GPs came to the realization that even the most alienating labor had meaning as a job that located a working class man in a particular place in his self, his family, and his community. Without that job, men dealt with problems of identity, mental health, and physical health. Families broke down, and men no longer knew how to position themselves as men. Wives became anxious, and husbands became abusive. Doctors' new understandings of work as more than a pay packet could only help in future encounters with their patients who were dealing with the health and other problems of unemployment. The doctors' essays also reveal their frustrations in managing their patients' employment, job loss, and health. They saw men hiding health problems in order to hold on to jobs until it was too late. They heard about employers looking for weak, unhealthy men to find excuses to let them go. Once men experienced unemployment, their health problems increased, which made it less likely they would be able to be reemployed. Men with existing health problems found themselves on the scrap heap with no hope, especially if they were past a certain age. Young school leavers entered the workforce with no promise of a job and turned to alcohol and drugs. The essayists mostly expressed their own sense of powerlessness, confronting a situation in which returning a patient to good health did little to guarantee that the patient would then be employable. The link between good health and employment was broken, and Thatcher's policies did little to promise a fix. And I'll leave this wonderful image up there.
Thank you, Marjorie. And since I'm thanking you, I'm also going to ask the first question here. I mean, there's so much to unpack here, and there's so many connections. I mean, even to, you know, the current economic climate of the U.S. today. But where is, I mean, you're an historian, so maybe this isn't a fair question, but what happened afterwards? Has there been a regain, a recoup in terms of, you know, in addressing some of these issues? In Britain, you know, how are things now, what, almost 40 years later?
Haven't gotten there, but the NHS has been increasingly pulled apart and privatized so that health inequities have continued to grow. I can say that. Unemployment is very regional. I mean, the early 80s, you know, that was bad. It is not as bad now, but there are pockets like Northeast England that, you know, the city of Newcastle has kind of come back and is really an up and coming, you know, I mean, it's like vibrant, and but areas around there, these old steel areas, say, and areas of South Wales, I mean, there are certain areas that were like the old coal areas and the old steel areas, the old industries that some of those have just not even come back from the 19th century, you know. They have the highest areas of unemployment. So the South, where are like the commuter areas around London, they're in awesome shape. So I mean, there is this definitely a north-south split in the UK. You know, but you're not going to see unemployment numbers like you were seeing in the 80s.
I have a comment. So I grew up in the UK. My father was a general practitioner, and so all of this is very familiar to me.
Where did he practice?
In Scotland, outside of Glasgow. But I think knowing a lot of GPs from this period, they were all trained and came in when the National Health Service was just beginning.
Right.
So they did not understand that social problems were not their social problems. The GPs were kind of seen in the community as the go-to person if you had any kind of an issue or problem. And then they didn't know what to do and they tried to fix it. I think now you have an understanding that these are social problems, and social organizations try to work on these particular issues. But, you know, you can feel the kind of the heartbreak in these general practitioners, and certainly I saw my father struggle with all of this, that there was no way to help, there were no social agencies to turn to, and so they could watch their communities falling apart.
Right, and there are other elements of these essays that kind of talk about very specifically, you know, that kind of paint, some of them are obviously, they're better writers, you know, as essayists. They really paint the picture of what's happened to the town, you know, how like the Albert Jacob from Dundee, he really paints a picture of, you know, how this was a very successful, you know, they didn't have an unemployment problem, what this looked like, and how, you know, I mean, it's very, they're very moving. They're very moving. In terms of getting an understanding of what happened to these towns. Yeah, thank you for coming.
So I also grew up in the UK and was in Newcastle from 1979 to 1987. So saw some of this stuff firsthand. And I think one element that isn't addressed by a lot of these issues is, of course, the industrial action that was going on at the time, the miners' strikes, which had the effect of not only, and in fact compounded the unemployment on one hand, but also ripped communities apart and destroyed, you know, some of their resources, and drove real wedges into what would typically have been a very supportive environment, even in the face of adversity. Because, you know, I got to know a lot of these people. I've been down coal mines and witnessed, you know, their working environment firsthand. And I think the problem was certainly exacerbated by the industrial action and Thatcher's policies that were determined to break them, and indeed she did. But that was definitely driving a wedge into communities. That was another factor.
A little after these essays, so they're not going to be capturing as much, you know, as much of that feeling.
Plus, the other element was then we declared war on Argentina, which took people's would implied a different focus on the country. And
I didn't hear the first thing you said.
The Falklands War was in
1982,
and that also changed perspective a bit, changed a little bit of focus, and partially, as wars do, unfortunately reinvigorated the economy. But and the regionality with unemployment is curious, and I think what happened towards the end of the 80s was that it became much more mobile in the UK, despite the fact it's only 1,000 miles from end to end. People did not venture far afield in employment, and I think that was overruled as well, kind of thing. But but you need to visit these places and talk to people. These essays are giving you a very, very tiny piece of the puzzle. Yeah.
Well, they're representation. That's.
Have another one if nobody else does. Because I'm interested, not surprisingly, in kind of the cultural and artistic productions during this period of time. Things like film, theater, novels, even sort of the punk movement. So how are you making connections? You're not there yet. I don't know, maybe maybe you have some experience around that, but when I think about this period of time and how it's represented in films like Train Spotting, I mean, the opening scenes of Train Spotting are actually almost, like these photographs in which we have these school leavers who have nothing to do but drugs and alcohol, and it's just so desolate and so depressing. And so you're going to look into those, and I mean it's so wide ranging, but it's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't figured out yet how I'm going to arrange the book, and so because I want to go from the 1830s to the 1980s, there's only so much and it's not going to be a survey. I feel like I want to look episodically, at particular issues, some of which will be particular to a time, some of which will cross over time. So it's not going to be a linear study, and I don't know yet how I'm going to treat that. Yeah, so this is the first with this. This is nice because it's just this discrete group of essays, that are fun to work with, and the doctors, you can tell, kind of enjoyed writing them. They're depressing. Well, you'll probably see other elements of it, right? Yeah. Thanks.